Hello, everyone watching this evening. I'm Koei, and welcome to the first airing of Venceremos, a channel where several young socialists provide a left-wing perspective to various news topics and events in the political and literary worlds. I am joined here this evening by Julian,
Hi.
Seamus,
Hello? Yeah, hello.
and Johnson.
Hello.
So tonight we will be discussing the recent news coming out of Georgia, where two Democrats, Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff, have secured victories in the two Georgia Senate runoffs, becoming the first Democratic senators from the state since Senator Zell Miller was appointed to fill Paul Coverdale's seat in 2000, which was 2 decades ago. Upon the election of these two men to the U.S. Senate, the culmination of the two most expensive Senate races in American political history and nearly 2 decades of field organizing and grassroots labor canvassing, the state of Georgia, which has historically been one of the most Republican states in the Union, has been pushed firmly onto the list of battleground states. From a socialist perspective, there's a lot to consider in how greater turnout from minority and youth voters, as well as better registration from blue-collar white women, turned America's most historically conservative state into the center of the growing Southern progressive movement. So, guys, thoughts?
It's definitely a state that you have to draw a lot of inspiration from in the rest of the South, but also rural areas where the Democrats used to have strongholds in. One of those states being Tennessee, where you had in just 2006 in the governor race, all the counties going Democratic, and then 2 cycles later in 2014, all the counties, including Shelby and Davidson, which include Memphis and Nashville respectively, going Republican. You have to take inspiration from, in Georgia's case, how C.C. Abrams and many other organizers were able to increase turnout in the Atlanta metro area. And you have to do that in other metro areas throughout.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that it is important to recognize the work of how we've managed to get here in terms of the place that Georgia is in now. I believe that in preparation to the 2020 election, from the numbers I've seen, 150,000 new voters registered, specifically coming up to the runoffs, which obviously were crucial in the final result. And there were a lot of organizations that contributed to that. We obviously know that Stacey Abrams' organization, Fair Fight, and some more left-leaning organizations as well, like Our Revolution and Democratic Socialists of America, registered a lot of people to vote.
Stacey Abrams really is the figurehead, per se, of everything that happened in terms of registration in Georgia. And you have people who could become that in other states. You just need the party apparatus in each state to give them the platform and to come together and give them the contacts in each area of each state.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's even interesting to look at how, at the end of the day, a lot of it wasn't ideological either. Because, for example, Voto Latino, which works to register Hispanic voters in pretty much every state, whether it is for a Republican Hispanic candidate or for a Democratic one, because obviously there is a variety, managed to register at least 15% of those voters from the numbers that we got from exit polls, which obviously represents a massive registration of minority voters that probably had never voted before. And that is definitely one of the reasons why the field organizing leading up to 2020 was so powerful, because it expanded the demographic coalition that helps Democrats win in a lot of these southern states in a way that had never happened before. So Julian, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, from my view, a lot of what we witnessed in Georgia was not so much a matter of which politician had better ideas. Obviously, the dynamic of discontent with the Trump administration did have an impact, but at the end of the day, a lot of it was just based off of who could register more voters and who could turn out more on election day. So that's why Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight effort, along with many, many other groups, played such a key role in deciding the winner in this election.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like, it is definitely really crucial to state just how important the work of independent organizations that, of course, as Seamus mentioned, not only is it really important to have the backing of sort of the party apparatus, but also a lot of independent activists played a really big role into what happened. Like Stacey Abrams doesn't even hold any current political office, but she has been continually a big face of the growing Democratic movement in Georgia. And I think that we see that reflected in a lot of other states as well. And like Johnson as well, I know that there has been a lot of attention from like the media and the press surrounding a lot of these people who aren't necessarily politicians, but still play a really big role in voter registration. So like, what do you think of the better voter registration numbers from this year?
Well, I think that in large part it started off with the governor race in 2018, where we saw a very competitive race there, and registration greatly improved. So I'd say that I really do think that the better registration numbers really did win them the day, because in 2018 they had it was quite close actually, but I think what pushed them over the edge this time, despite 2018 being a better year overall for Democrats, was their registration was built off of what work they had done in 2018.
Yeah, I mean, 2018 was really a foundation-laying cycle, you could say. And while Stacey Abrams was absolutely screwed over by Georgia and the election officials, it in large part was showing, oh, hey, the Democrats can actually do stuff in Georgia, and how they can do stuff in other southern states, which you have not seen on a level in decades.
And 2018 also brought to light the importance of voter registration. Because if I remember correctly, Stacey Abrams, she was actually purged from the voter roll herself for an election that she was running in. So these issues were really brought to light thanks to that election. And with this knowledge and this new understanding of the importance of voter registration, this knowledge helped them win in 2020 to deliver the presidential election in Georgia to Biden, as well as these two runoff elections.
Again, I mean, like we've said multiple times already, registration is a key factor, and you have to have you have to build up the party apparatus enough to support statewide, county by county registration turnout. And I mean, you just don't have that support in other states yet.
Right, and you bring up a really good point in how in a state as close as Georgia, like a lot of smaller counties are still statistically significant, and I think that we saw a great shift between 2018, which was already a historically good year for Democrats, and 2020, where Biden ended up winning Georgia by a fairly slim margin. But you saw added Democratic voters in a lot of those driftless rural counties, which have been trending Republican more and more so. And even if, it's really just like 800 additional voters in one county or like 600 in another, like that vote total does build up to a point where a lot of the rural counties combined are, practically the gains are like as if it were in an urban area when you add enough of them up, which is very interesting because that is also the pool of voters which historically has been trending away from the Democrats in the last 2 decades. Like you mentioned, Seamus, in the Tennessee gubernatorial race from several cycles ago, where all of those rural counties, which now are fairly consistently Republican, voted for the Democrats. But obviously now that's not even close to the case, which also carries us on into a very interesting note of some of the differences between how Ossoff and Warnock were able to win these Senate runoffs and how Democrats have historically won Georgia in the past. There's a big example that's often brought up in the press and in other election analysis, which is Senator Nunn, who served Georgia as a Democratic senator in the 1990s. He won Georgia by historically large margins before he eventually left the Senate, which was seen as fairly groundbreaking for the Democrats, primarily because he made big gains in a lot of the smaller rural counties. But of course, his platform was extremely different from what we see now in the 2020 election, because he was
The big shocker, in my view, and in some other people's views, is how, while Warnock is not your typical run-of-the-mill progressive as compared to like Bernie Sanders or AOC, he's still pretty left-leaning, especially for a southern state such as Georgia, and how he was able to win so much, and he's on track to get, if not already, the most votes of any statewide candidate in Georgia's history. I just find it shocking how a candidate like him is able to do that in Georgia.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think that you made the very interesting notion of how, we look at how Warnock compares to a lot of these other Georgia Democrats, and by no means is he really a solid left-wing candidate. Like he's not a socialist or even necessarily a progressive in the context of states like New York. But he is still significantly more left-wing than some of these traditional Georgia Democrats, as I mentioned, who were able to win in the 1990s, which also plays into turnout, because a lot of those candidates were able to get a lot better margins with rural counties, but also turnout wasn't that great compared to how it is now.
Well, I'd just like to say that difference between now and then was that the suburbs significantly shifted. So, for example, if we look at the presidential race, and this is a nationwide thing actually, where you see suburbs narrowly won by Biden, urban areas going quite strongly for Biden, and rural areas basically doing the inverse and going for Trump quite strongly. So I think that with demographic shifts we've seen, like for instance, Carolyn Bordeaux winning in a suburban district in Atlanta, we can see that the suburbs have really shifted towards Democrats in these past few years, and as well as college-educated people versus people without college degrees. We can really see a shift from cycle to cycle towards them.
I mean, again, the whole registration and campaigning, door-to-door campaigning on the scale of what happened in Georgia is key to the demographic shifts in all of these suburban counties and areas, and really have to maintain or even increase that to continue winning the state level races on the same margins or even higher. Because if I'm not mistaken, Republican turnout in the runoffs were relatively lower than in the presidential race. And that was because there's not a presidential candidate to help carry out more turnout, but it's still something to be wary of.
Yeah, and I also would like everyone's general perspective on looking at some of the small gains that Democrats have made with rural voters in this specific election cycle. Like, is there any way that we could possibly build on that in the future, not just for Democrats, but for left-wing candidates in general?
I mean, the left in general really has to, at least in these rural areas, focus their economic policies on rural revitalization. And until they can do that, you're not going to see much gain in rural areas.
Well,
right, for sure. Oh yes, go ahead, Johnson.
Well, I think that they have a lot of the right policies. It's just about messaging. Like, yeah, they could change a policy or two to become more appealing, but at the end of the day, if you aren't putting that policy on billboards, then you aren't going to change much on the margins.
Again, I mean, yeah, this all ties into...
Most of it is about, yeah.
This all ties into getting the party apparatus together and getting more campaigning across the state, and, like you said, changing their messaging and all of that. This all ties in together.
Yeah.
Right, of course. And I mean, I also think that, like, in Georgia, we've seen a lot of examples of Democrats who've been able to win over voters with being more moderate on some of the social issues. Like, Georgia has had many pro-life senators from both the Democrats and the Republicans in the 80s and the 90s. But also, I do think that Warnock, who, as we were earlier stating, is to the left of pretty much every Georgia Democratic Senate candidate of the past, like, 20, 30 years, who still made concrete gains with rural voters, at least in certain places. And I think has, at least in part, helped disavow the notion that social conservatism is the easiest way to reach out to rural voters, because we have seen that, at least through Warnock's win, Ossoff didn't do necessarily as well with rural voters, but Warnock's win does show us that economic progressivism is still a tangible way to reach out to rural voters.
Well, compiled with effective messaging, yes. But also, I don't think we should be comparing the politicians from before the year 2000 to people who win in the year 2020, not just because of the whole Overton window shifting, but also because there has been a significant amount of growth in the suburbs in southern states that we now see as swing states. So you have southern states that have shifted towards the Democrats. You have Georgia, you have North Carolina, and you have Virginia as some of the main states where not only has the suburban population gained, and the Democrats have gained there, but that outweighs their losses in the rural areas.
Yeah, for sure. I think we can probably move on to discussing in what ways progressive voters were extremely important in these victories. Because, I mean, I personally am not too super read into the exit polls, but I mean, just given the state of polarization that we currently have, there is part of me that kind of doubts that a lot of voters did switch from Republican to Democrat in between 2020 compared to some recent elections. I agree with what Julian said earlier, which was that this was definitely a game of turnout, not necessarily a game of winning over the prior base of voters. So, to what extent did progressive voters who may have previously voted third party or have just been in general not as vocal in Georgia play to the victories of Ossoff and Warnock in the runoffs?
I would argue that they played a pretty large part due to how close both races were. And while on the face of it, there might not be as many progressives in Georgia as, say, in like California or New York, they still are a body that the Democrats have got to tap into. And whether that's by running progressive candidates in Atlanta metro area and running not nearly as progressive candidates on the state level and getting them to turn out for that election based off of other down ballot candidates, I mean, it's still a base that, again, the Democrats have got to tap into and have to continue their turnout and support for.
And another thing that I find is that progressive groups, they are often grassroots movements, and they have very strong connections with the community. So those connections were likely able to turn out voters, which, as we know, was key in this election.
The whole progressive grassroots movements, you have to have them connect to the party, or the overall party apparatus in each of these states, just to help increase. I mean, like you said, Julian, they have ties to local communities and whatnot, and the party will be able to get their candidates in touch with these communities, which is crucial for increasing turnout and whatnot.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it is quite interesting as well because I think it's really important to highlight these ideological differences because yes, Ossoff and Warnock definitely played to the left of prior Georgia Democrats, but they were also by no means progressive in the sense of what we think of on the state, on the national level. Like some of the national leading figures of the American left, like Ossoff and Warnock, aren't really close necessarily to them on a lot of the more important economic issues. But I think, like, from a leftist perspective, it is still a pretty major improvement compared to the centrists that Democrats were running, in the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, which...
I mean, it's much better than running someone like Phil Bredesen in Tennessee, who's a full-on centrist. I mean, at least with Warnock, you have some pretty left-leaning labor policies, and I mean, I'm pretty sure both Ossoff and Warnock support full legalization of weed, or at least decriminalization and stuff like that. I mean, you'll be able to get these policies through, whereas if you had full-on center establishment Democrat, or more so establishment Democrats, you wouldn't be able to get these through.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think moving into the final point, which I know, Seamus, you have a lot of thoughts on, which is how can we and the progressive movement in general look at what's been done in Georgia and the gradual buildup of registered voters cycle by cycle and apply that to other states where Republicans have been dominant for a long time and Democrats have maybe been neglecting those areas as places where pickups aren't viable?
Like, I've touched a bit on this a lot throughout. You have to, like I've said, you have to strengthen the party apparatus, get these grassroots movements connected to the overall party establishment, and you have to run candidates in county level elections and have them move up through state House, state Senate, etc. It's what the Tennessee Republican Party did in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s when they were absolutely lost and didn't have any power whatsoever within Tennessee. And you can see how the demographics have completely shifted in the past 30 years. In 2010, it was the first time that the Republicans held both state legislatures in Tennessee since Reconstruction. And with Bill Haslam and Bill Lee, it's the first time that we've had back-to-back Republican governors in Tennessee since Reconstruction. The method that the Republicans have increased turnout in Tennessee has shown to work, and you have to take what they did and build upon it for the Democrats. And the one gain in the Tennessee legislature for the Democrats was in the Senate. It was Edie Campbell, who was the former Oak Hill mayor, and she was able to flip a historically pretty right-leaning Senate seat because of name recognition within the area that she was mayor of.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of lessons can be learned from some of those other southern states. And you do make a good point of not just looking at the work of field organizers for the Democrats, but also the way that Republicans have been able to win over a block of voters which used to be more reliably Democratic in the past, which is, I think, extremely critical in the reason why a lot of more rural states have switched to voting Republican more consistently over the past several decades, but also why the work in Georgia is extremely interesting in looking of how it could be applied to other states and elections in other places in the country. So everyone's final thoughts on this?
Yeah, actually. Well, first off, on sort of rebuilding Democratic parties on the state level, what you have to do is basically a complete reversal of what's been happening over the past 10 years, specifically under Obama. Right? So, under Obama, nearly 1,000 state legislative seats were lost by the Democrats. Now, yes,
2010 onward. Yeah.
These types of things happen when, swings against the incumbent party, but nothing to this scale or magnitude. In addition to that, state party funding has dramatically fallen. While, let's say, a Republican state, let's say a Republican state party is raising around $100 million. The Democrats may only be reaching half of that on some of their better days. You have to have the resources to build up infrastructure. So, and we can't do is basically abandon winning in half of the states because you think, oh, if we focus on the quote-unquote winnable states, that we will we'll be able to secure 47% of the seats. Whereas in reality, you're just investing money into safe seats while not expanding outreach to areas that could flip a few cycles down the line.
Yeah, like you said, you can't really... I'd argue that you can't be funding these candidates like Jamie Harrison or Amy McGrath.
Oh no, it was a massive blunder to be investing
you
that
have
much money.
divert that funding towards state legislature seats all over the country, and so you can build up candidates to hopefully upset Lindsey Graham or Mitch McConnell later on down the line. And while it was very tempting to get, your two largest foes, per se, in the Senate out, didn't have a shot. And the massive funding that the Democrats appropriated in those two Senate races was absolutely detrimental to their overall strategy in other Senate seats, but also in the state legislatures in this cycle alone.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with messaging, like specifically by the media. So you had large numbers of individual contributions going to people like Amy McGrath. And she, these types of candidates who were going to lose by, 15, 20-point margins in the first place, and funding wasn't going to do much. On, let's say, cable television or cable news, they'd be fawning all over these candidates as if they're have an equal chance of winning as someone in, let's say, Iowa or North Carolina, where in reality, the only thing that does is create fake enthusiasm for these candidates. And while yes, a 50-state strategy or a 33-seat strategy for the Senate is desirable, you have to shore up not only your safe seats, not only your competitive seats you currently hold, like in Michigan, but you also have to lock up more competitive states. And we really saw a failure of that. North Carolina, Maine, Iowa, states that looked like they were going to be a lot closer than they were. The results for them, they completely flopped, basically.
Yeah, again, like you've said multiple times over the past, you have to change your messaging. Another thing that is pretty big, you have to overturn Citizens United, which heavily tilted the whole political spectrum towards wealthy people and corporations, and how they were pretty much able to buy elections. You also have to use the money you appropriate to each candidate. And again, you have to increase turnout, and you have to build up these candidates from the local level on through the federal.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the idea of buying elections, although that's a complete it's related, but it's another really big issue. All you have to do is look at 2020's California's Proposition 22, where the big tech companies essentially poured hundreds of millions of dollars into that election. And then Californian voters thought, hey, this would be a good thing. And then it passed by around nearly 20 points. But returning to the idea of messaging, a large part for the Democrats is dispelling this idea that they're coastal elites, which often they are. Nancy Pelosi has a net worth of I believe over $100 million. But a lot of the other candidates who might not be are still have to deal with this idea that the Democratic Party is the party of coastal elites. And when you have these voters in suburbs or even rural counties, rural areas, it's something that's really discouraging, and that it's an impediment for the Democrats.
Well, it's an impediment because it's basically true. Democrats didn't win Georgia by improving by 10 points in rural areas. Sure, they improved by 5 points or so, maybe, in some rural counties. But what they did was they heightened they made much larger gains in the suburbs, which pushed them over the edge. They didn't win Virginia the governorship in 2017 by making a massive comeback with rural voters. They simply made larger gains with urban voters, and there's a much larger pool to pick from. Same story across the country, actually, in suburbs in 2018. Democrats flipped several important seats in the Philadelphia suburbs. They flipped several important seats in the Detroit suburbs. Orange County, they flipped several seats. All over the country, you can see a trend where more affluent and upper middle class people are shifting towards the Democrats because of their messaging, whereas traditionally white working class voters are shifting towards the Republicans. So I believe there was this quote from Chuck Schumer that was like, for every one voter we lose in southwestern Pennsylvania, we gain 2 voters in the Philadelphia suburbs. And while the math isn't exactly correct, he isn't wrong, but also the analogy forgets that, well, you don't, that isn't always in the best interest of the majority. Like, once your base becomes a bunch of rich people, you start turning up policies that favor the rich even more than they already do. And I really think that would be and I really think that's detrimental to the overall health of the country, to have 2 parties that are even more subservient to the rich than they already are.
Yeah, it's a very good final thought, and thank you for joining us tonight, everyone.